As soon as the enemy was sighted, the northern CVE group changed course to 090 degree due east and began launching all available aircraft. Scarcely had the planes been sent aloft when large-caliber shells began falling among the units of the formation. Admiral Kurita was closing rapidly, straddling the U.S. escort carriers with die-marked salvos that landed with uncomfortable accuracy and bracketed their targets with red, yellow, green and blue splashes. The situation was most critical, and from this point on it was only a question of how to save the greatly outnumbered and outgunned U.S. ships from almost certain destruction. At 0701, the commander of the Northern CVE Group reported the alarming news that he was in contact with the enemy and urgently needed assistance. He then ordered a general retirement to the southwest in the hope of obtaining support from the heavy forces in Leyte Gulf. Admiral Kincaid received the request for support at 0724 and promptly ordered Admiral Oldendorf to prepare to rendezvous his forces at the eastern end of Leyte Gulf. The escort carrier planes were sent the same order, and a dispatch was transmitted to Admiral Halsey requesting immediate aid. Admiral Kurita pushed the attack vigorously. His ships gradually closed and continued to send a steady avalanche of shells at the escort carriers. Huge geysers of water erupted around Admiral Sprague's units as the big Japanese batteries began to find the range. As the battle developed, Admiral Kurita, intent on encircling the retiring U.S. ships, deployed several of his cruisers on the left flank from where they delivered the most troublesome fire of the battle. Several destroyers were also deployed on the right flank, while the rest of his force pressed the attack from astern. Along with these surface attacks, Japanese air units based in the Philippines launched a series of kamikaze strikes against the U.S. carriers. In his great distress, Admiral Kincaid sent Admiral Halsey another dispatch. "Urgently need fast BBs Leyte Gulf at once." Admiral Halsey responded to the 7th Fleet's appeal by ordering Vice ADM John S. McCain, commander of Task Group 38.1, which had been refueling to the east, to attack the enemy at San Bernardino as soon as possible. Meanwhile, the 3rd Fleet continued to steam northward in hot pursuit of the Japanese carrier group. Admiral Sprague's escort carriers used every trick of sea fighting to escape the heavy fire of the Japanese fleet and to inflict losses on the enemy. Evasive tactics were ordered, thick smoke screens were laid down, temporary refuge was sought in a providential rain squall. In a desperate effort to stem the enemy advance, the destroyers and destroyer escorts fought back furiously. Interposing themselves between the carriers and their adversary, they boldly closed the range and fired their 5-inch guns and torpedoes at cruiser and battleship targets. Both the Johnston and the Heermann challenged the Congo. The escort carriers also engaged with gunfire whatever units of the enemy came within range. At the same time, their planes attacked the enemy continuously and succeeded in putting several of his cruiser units out of action. They were greatly handicapped, however, by the damage inflicted on the carriers. The pilots, seeing their carrier decks ripped open or their ships sunk, made forced landings on the already overcrowded airstrip at Tacloban. Some also landed on the Dulag Strip, while others were compelled at the last minute to ditch their planes in Leyte Gulf. As the battle progressed, the situation became more desperate for the U.S. units. With disaster staring him in the face, Admiral Kincaid sent Admiral Halsey another urgent dispatch, which the latter received at 0900. "Our CVEs being attacked by 4 BBs, 8 cruisers plus others. Request Lee cover Leyte at top speed. Request fast carriers make immediate strike." By this time, ammunition aboard the escort carriers was running low. Some of the destroyers had expended their torpedoes, and the torpedo planes were reduced to the dire expedient of making dummy runs on the enemy ships. Both the screening force and the carriers sustained considerable damage. The Gambier Bay was hit hard and sank at 0911, with an enemy cruiser pumping shells into her at a range of less than 2,000 yards. The destroyer Johnston, which had been under continuous heavy fire, was fatally struck and had to be abandoned. She rolled over and sank at 10:10. The destroyer Hoef and the destroyer escort Roberts were also sunk. Early damage was also inflicted on the escort carriers Santee, Suwanee, and Sangamon. At 0922, Admiral Halsey received a dispatch sent by Admiral Kinkaid at 0725. Under attack by cruisers and battleships, request immediate airstrikes. Also request support by heavy ships. My OBB's low in ammunition. Meanwhile, off Samar, victory lay within Admiral Kurita's grasp. After almost 2.5 hours of continuous battle, the flanking enemy units began closing in, firing salvo after salvo at the escort carriers, dodging desperately to avoid more damage. By 0920, the heavy cruiser Tone was within 10,000 yards of her targets, and on the starboard flank, the Japanese 10th Destroyer Squadron pressed the attack with torpedoes. The situation had become virtually hopeless for Admiral Sprague's task group, and few expected to come out of the ordeal afloat. Once more, Admiral Kinkaid sent an insistent plea to Admiral Halsey, this time in the clear. "Where is Lee? Send Lee." Almost simultaneously, Admiral Halsey received an urgent dispatch from Admiral Nimitz in Pearl Harbor. "The whole world wants to know where is Task Force 34. Then, as if in answer to fervent prayer, the unexpected happened. Admiral Kurita broke off the engagement. His units had sustained no little damage, and like everyone else, he was unaware of the true battle situation. He therefore ordered his forces to cease firing and reassemble to the north. For the U.S. carrier forces, this retirement by the enemy meant a remarkable and completely unexpected escape. Admiral Sprague, in summing up the results of the battle shortly thereafter, stated, "The failure of the enemy, main body, and encircling light forces to completely wipe out all vessels of this task unit can be attributed to our successful smokescreen, our torpedo counterattack, continuous harassment of the enemy by bomb, torpedo, and strafing air attacks, timely maneuvers, and the definite partiality of Almighty God." The continuous and urgent dispatches from Admiral Kinkaid and the cryptic message from Admiral Nimitz finally led Admiral Halsey to change course and direct the bulk of his fleet southward toward Leyte. He accordingly directed Task Force 34 under Admiral Lee and Task Group 38.2 under Rear ADM. Gerald F. Bogan to proceed south towards San Bernardino Strait. At exactly 14:35, when he was expecting the pagoda masts of Admiral Ozawa's force to appear over the horizon at any minute, he made the crucial decision to return to Leyte Gulf. He expected to arrive early the next morning. The other units of the Third Fleet, Admiral Mitcher's Task Force 38 with Task Group 38.3 under Admiral Sherman and Task Group 38.4 under Admiral Davidson, were to continue against the enemy carrier force. Throughout the afternoon of the 25th of October, Third Fleet carrier planes struck Admiral Ozawa's force again and again. When the battle was over, the Japanese had lost the famous carrier Zuikaku and the 3 light carriers Chitose, Chiyoda, and Zuiho. 1 light cruiser and 2 destroyers were also sunk, but the 2 hermaphrodite battleship carriers Issei and Hyuga escaped with minor damage. United States forces suffered no surface losses in the engagement. After regrouping his forces and evaluating the situation, Admiral Kurita decided to make one last attempt against Leyte Gulf. At 11:20, he ordered his ships to change course toward the target area to the southwest. He was en route approximately 1 hour, however, and only 45 miles from his objective when he finally decided to give up the attempt. At 12:36, he ordered his ships about. As he retraced his course to the northwest, his force came under attack by planes from the 7th and 3rd Fleets. Although he had sustained considerable damage, Admiral Kurita managed to limp through San Bernardino Strait at 21:30 on the 25th of October. Of his original force of 32 ships, he escaped with 4 battleships, 4 cruisers, and 7 destroyers. In the meantime, Admiral Halsey came racing down from the north with his big battleships. They were not to fire a shot, however, for when they arrived it was too late. Admiral Kurita had escaped. In an evaluation of the battle, Admiral Sprague's humble recognition of divine intervention must be read in conjunction with Admiral Halsey's radio dispatched on the day of impending disaster. To prevent any misunderstanding concerning recent Third Fleet operations, I inform you as follows. It became vital on the 23rd of October to obtain information of Japanese plans, so 3 carrier groups were moved to the Philippine coast off Polillo, San Bernardino, and Surigao to search as far west as possible. On the 24th of October, 3rd Fleet Air struck at Japanese forces moving east through the Sibuyan and Sulu Seas. Apparently the enemy planned a coordinated attack, but their objective was not ascertained, and no carrier force located until afternoon of the 24th of October, merely to guard San Bernardino Strait, while the enemy was coordinating his surface and carrier air force would be time wasted. So 3 carrier groups were concentrated and moved north for a surprise dawn attack on the carrier fleet. Estimated the enemy force in the Sibuyan Sea too damaged to threaten COM-7 THFLT, a deduction proved correct by events of the 25th of October off Surigao. The enemy carrier force caught off guard, offering no air opposition over the target or against our force. Evidently their air groups were land-based, arriving too late to fight. I had projected surface strike units ahead of our carriers in order to coordinate surface and air attacks against the enemy. COM-7 THFLT sent urgent appeal for assistance just when my overwhelming force was within 45 miles of the crippled enemy. I had no alternative but to head south in response to the call, although I was convinced his opponents were badly damaged from our attack of the 24th of October, a conviction later justified by events off Leyte. The command decisions during the battle for Leyte Gulf require a realistic appraisal. The events off Leyte were the free entry of Admiral Kurita's force into the Leyte area to a point where the complete destruction of the U.S. transports and escort carriers was an immediate and frightful possibility. Except for the superb and sacrificial intervention of a covering force under Admiral Sprague, the brilliant operation of Admiral Oldendorf in Surigao Strait, and the fortunate decision of Admiral Kurita, the results of the battle would have been different. During the course of these critical naval operations, the Japanese air forces had intensified their attacks both on sea and shore. The 7th Fleet was busily occupied in a struggle for survival, employing its air strength to fight off hordes of hostile planes, attacking in coordination with enemy fleet units. Its problem was further complicated by the appearance of kamikaze pilots, whose novel kamikaze tactics initially caused considerable havoc. On land, General MacArthur's troops, without adequate air cover, were exposed to continuous and damaging raids by enemy planes. Bombing and strafing from treetop levels interfered with the unloading of supplies and hampered the progress of the advance into Leyte. In addition, under cover of their naval operations, the Japanese had succeeded in landing 2,000 troop reinforcements from Cagayan at Ormoc on the 25th of October. The Japanese admirals had played for high stakes and lost. Their plan missed success, however, by only a slim margin. Had the Central Force adhered to its mission and proceeded into Leyte Gulf, the American invasion would, in all probability, have experienced a setback of incalculable proportions. The enemy's heavy guns would have experienced little trouble in pounding the remaining transports and landing craft. Shore positions and troop installations could have been bombarded almost at leisure, and Admiral Kurita could then have continued on towards Surigao Strait. At this stage of the game, the weakened escort carriers and the ammunition-depleted battleships of the 7th Fleet could have offered only relatively minor opposition. The intervention of the 3rd Fleet was too far removed to cause immediate tactical concern. Within the narrow limits of a lost opportunity, the Japanese Navy, however, had suffered a crushing and fatal defeat. The enemy fleet, as an integral unit, was no longer to be reckoned as a major factor in future operations, and his carrier force especially was now known to be impotent. The greatest sea battle in history left the remaining units of the Japanese Navy increasingly vulnerable to future Allied naval and air strikes. Against the background of this decisive naval victory, the strong wedge of General MacArthur's ground forces was driven solidly into the vulnerable Japanese flank on Leyte. If he could establish his forces securely in the central Philippines, the Japanese would be powerless to prevent him from overrunning the rest of the archipelago and bisecting the Japanese Empire. In recognition of the overwhelming naval victory, General MacArthur sent the following message of appreciation to Admiral Nimitz. At this time I wish to express to you and to all elements of your fine command my deep appreciation of the splendid service they have rendered in the recent Leyte operation. Their record needs no amplification from me, but I cannot refrain from expressing the admiration everyone here feels for their magnificent conduct. All of your elements, ground, naval, and air, have alike covered themselves with glory. We could not have gone along without them. To you, my special thanks for your sympathetic and understanding cooperation. The decisive defeat of the enemy fleet in the waters of the Philippines meant the failure of only one phase of Japan's threefold plan for disrupting the Allied invasion of Leyte. Despite the loss of the naval battle, Japanese efforts in the air and on the ground were intensified rather than diminished. By bringing in plane reinforcements from Formosa and Kyushu to numerous existing bases in Luzon, they were able to maintain a continuous aerial offensive against the Allied transports and fleet units in Leyte Gulf throughout the landing period. Vigorous enemy air assaults began in the afternoon of the 24th of October, with numerous low-level attacks upon Allied beachhead installations. During the next few days, a sustained series of heavy raids by 150-250 planes was directed against escort carrier forces and other surface units. Headquarters of the 6th Army and General MacArthur's command post in Tacloban did not escape attack. Direct hits were scored within a block of General MacArthur's billet, and the headquarters company was struck on Thanksgiving Day. These raids marked the first appearance of the suicidal kamikaze attack pilot, whose startling debut caused considerable consternation among Allied naval commanders and inflicted widespread destruction on U.S. fleet units in the Leyte area. On the 29th of October, a kamikaze plane crashed into the 3rd Fleet carrier Intrepid. The next day, the carriers Franklin and Belleau Wood were struck, resulting in severe damage and loss of personnel. On the 1st of November, the 7th Fleet lost one destroyer to kamikaze planes and suffered serious hits on 5 others. 4 days later, the Lexington signal bridge was blasted by a kamikaze plane. The necessity of dealing with the dangerous threat of these kamikaze attacks forced the carriers to commit their planes to their own protection at the expense of furnishing support to the Leyte ground forces. Allied efforts to counter these kamikaze attacks and to cover the advancing ground troops were hampered by a delay in the construction of suitable airfields on Leyte. Heavy monsoon rains and difficult terrain had disrupted the schedule for the development of the vital American airbase at Tacloban. The Japanese naturally realized the importance of Tacloban and attacked the airstrip continuously, causing severe destruction to its closely parked planes and incomplete installations, seriously impeding its development. One of these raids was particularly successful, destroying 27 planes on the ground. The reckless Japanese pilots sometimes followed American flight formations into the landing areas. The explosion of ammunition dumps or oil storage tanks became an almost nightly occurrence. Except for the vicious air bombardment of Corregidor at the outbreak of the war, never before in the Pacific had the Japanese blanketed an Allied position with such powerful, sustained, and effective air action. The land phase of the enemy's coordinated attack plan was also comparatively unaffected by the outcome of the naval battle. Taking full advantage of the temporary insecurity of the American air position, the Japanese poured a steady stream of reinforcements into Leyte from Luzon and the neighbouring islands. The 2,000 troops that had been landed at Ormoc on the 26th of October were followed by other convoys of fresh forces. Additional units of the Japanese 30th and 102nd Divisions were sent from the Visayas and Mindanao and landed during the closing days of October. A first-class veteran outfit, the 1st Division, en route from Manchuria to Luzon, was diverted to Leyte and, after disembarking successfully on the 1st of November, was immediately committed to the defence of the Ormoc corridor. At the same time, elements of the 26th Division arrived to swell the total of Japanese troops on the island. These reinforcements made it clear that the enemy intended to hold Leyte at all costs and expected to fight for the Philippines in earnest. The decision to make a major stand on Leyte was a modification of Japan's original plan to defend the Philippines. Prior to the Allied invasion, it had been decided that the main ground battle would be fought on Luzon, and that only delaying tactics would be employed in the southern Philippines and in the Leyte area. This plan, it was hoped, would give the Japanese time to strengthen their forces on Luzon, and thereby put them in a position to repel or at least greatly delay General MacArthur's conquest of the entire Philippines. Several factors, however, influenced the Japanese High Command to alter the initial plan and to order that a decisive stand be made on Leyte. The mistakenly optimistic reports on the losses of the U.S. Third Fleet in the Battle off Formosa and the consequent supposed weakness of the U.S. carrier fleet led to a belief that the Japanese land-based air forces could win control of the skies over the Leyte beachhead. It was also thought, in view of the fact that the U.S. landings came so soon after the Morotai operation and the Formosa battle, that General MacArthur might be committing his forces without full preparation or adequate protection. In addition, it was feared that should the Allies gain air bases on Leyte, any defence of Luzon would be made immeasurably more difficult. Therefore, Imperial General Headquarters and Field Marshal Terauchi, in overall command of the Japanese Southern Army, felt that Leyte provided an excellent opportunity for a concerted effort by their combined air, naval, and ground forces to defeat and destroy the American invasion troops. General Yamashita, in direct command of the Japanese ground forces in the Philippines, was opposed to this alteration of the original plan and was reluctant to pour his troops into Leyte for hasty deployment on an unprepared front at the expense of his Luzon defences. Large-scale U.S. carrier raids against the Philippines on the 17th, 18th and 19th of October had convinced him that the U.S. naval forces were still extremely powerful and were evidently well prepared to cover any Allied invasion. Despite his objections, however, General Yamashita was ordered to dispatch reinforcements immediately and annihilate the enemy invading Leyte. In accordance with these direct orders, he scrapped his original plan, which called for delaying tactics on Leyte, and commanded that the Japanese will fight the decisive battle of the Philippines on Leyte. Despite numerous and damaging Allied attacks on the Leyte convoys, he had succeeded by early November in moving at least 25,000 additional troops and service elements into western Leyte to augment the original defence force. While the Japanese were disembarking their reinforcements and manoeuvring into position for a counterattack, General MacArthur's troops continued to drive inland and along the coast in a two-pronged attack and envelopment. Except for isolated strong points, such as Catman Hill behind the 24-4 Corps beachhead, only minor opposition was encountered, although enemy resistance was now more determined. By the end of October, the 20-yard 4 Corps had secured a rough square bounded by Tanawan and Dulag on the coast, and Dagami and Burauen, about 10 miles inland, at the western edge of Leyte Valley. Elements of the 7th Division moved south along the coast on Highway No. 1 toward Abuyog, the eastern terminus of a fairly good road running completely across Leyte from the Gulf to Bay on the Camotes Sea. Other elements of this division, together with units from the 96th, established and maintained contact near Dagami. Stiffening enemy resistance was met west of the road from Dagami to Burauen, about 8 miles to the south. The 96th Division established and maintained contact with the X-Corps to the north. In the zone of the X-Corps, the 24th Division, after securing Hill 522, moved west through Leyte Valley along Highway No. 2. Jaro, approximately 15 miles inland from Palo, was reached on the 29th of October in the face of stubborn resistance by the enemy entrenched in the hills and ridges along the valley. The 1st Cavalry Division, meanwhile, cleared both sides of San Juanico Strait and instituted extensive patrolling on southwestern Samar. Similar amphibious operations took some of the cavalrymen around the northeastern tip of Leyte past Babatangon to Barugo on Carigara Bay. Other units of the division, driving northwest from Tacloban into rugged mountainous terrain along the Diet River, moved through the northern reaches of the Leyte Valley to San Miguel, southeast of Carigara. At this time, several counterattacks in strength and increasing opposition in general indicated that the Japanese intended to make a determined stand at Carigara, a key terminus of the valley roads leading from Leyte's east coast. The X-Corps, therefore, consolidated its units in preparation for a coordinated attack on Carigara by both the 1st Cavalry and 24th Divisions, moving along the shores of Carigara Bay and up Highway No. 2. On the 2nd of November, the combined attack was launched, and the X-Corps units moved forward only to discover that the town had been abandoned by the enemy. It became apparent that under cover of a successful delaying action, the Japanese had withdrawn to stronger positions in the high ground behind Carigara in an effort to spar for time until their reinforcements could be brought up from Ormoc. As the American forces pressed forward from the east coast of Leyte, the Japanese continued to move large reinforcements into Ormoc. There were indications late in November that the Japanese were sending troops of the 55th Independent Mixed Brigade from faraway Jolo in the Sulu archipelago, in addition to the remainder of the 1st and 26th Divisions, which arrived from Luzon between 9 and the 11th of November. Allied planes were not idle during these Japanese convoy movements. The entire enemy cargo of artillery and equipment sent in a subsequent shipment was destroyed in a savage Allied aerial attack, and all 5 ships of the convoy, including its destroyer escort, were sunk. To circumvent the persistent attacks upon their convoys, the Japanese set up a barge shuttle system between Cebu and Ormoc to carry in troops from the Visayas under cover of darkness. The enemy also turned Leyte's seasonal storms and unceasing rains to advantage by operating their convoys at full speed, while the weather prevented U.S. planes from leaving their carriers. The heavy and continuous tropical rainfall became a serious impediment to the scheduled progress of operations. Important roads were turned into rivers of mud, slowing and at times halting the movement of supplies to the advancing forces. Communication lines were constantly disrupted, and contact between units was difficult to maintain. The poor drainage and swampy soil continued to delay the conditioning of the vital airstrips, leaving ground troops without adequate land-based air support for combat operations. Again, the key to the situation in the initial phase of the operation, as General MacArthur had anticipated, was air power. Not only was it important to provide adequate air cover for his ground operations, but the immediate reduction of the enemy's defensive air strength was imperative. Realizing that the general strategic situation had changed, General MacArthur requested that the carriers of the Third Fleet continue to be used to give his forces additional air cover. It is now evident that the enemy had decided to make a decisive stand in western Leyte in order to delay our further advance in the Philippines, thereby gaining time for preparation for the defence of Luzon. The Leyte phase must be pressed with the utmost vigour to completion. It is therefore essential that the arrival of convoys now en route be on schedule. The hard-to-convey risks must be accepted as a legitimate risk of war. In this general connection, I am convinced that the support of fast carriers is likewise essential to current operations, until Army Air is established in Leyte in sufficient strength to hit all enemy air bases in the Philippines in full neutralizing force. I am requesting Admiral Nimitz to utilize the Third Fleet accordingly. The dangerous shortage of air power and the rapidly increasing opposition from a greatly strengthened enemy made it necessary for General MacArthur to bring additional forces into Leyte. Toward the middle of November, the 32nd Division and the 112th Cavalry Regimental Combat Team, both veterans of many previous campaigns in the Southwest Pacific, were sent into action in the zone of X-Corps. When it became apparent that the Japanese were committing the bulk of their forces in an offensive northward along the Ormoc corridor, General Kruger decided to hold the initiative by constant pressure on all fronts. His strategy contemplated launching a strong assault southward from the direction of Pinamopoan, while simultaneously pushing forward with units of both the X and 24 Corps in order to penetrate into the Ormoc Valley. As soon as practicable, another arm of his forces would commence a drive northward along the coast from Bay. If practicable, the vulnerable west flank of the Japanese would be attacked by an amphibious landing at Ormoc. After occupying Karigara on the 2nd of November, elements of the X-Corps advanced westward to Kapukan and Pinamopoan at the northern end of the Ormoc corridor. The 24th Division began an advance south from Pinamopoan down Highway No. 2 toward Valencia and Ormoc. In the Limon area, however, the Japanese put up a stubborn fight from strong positions on the high ground of Breakneck Ridge, and the progress of the division was bitterly contested. It was not until the 14th of November that the ridge defences were overcome and the enemy forces cleared from the area. At this time, the exhausted elements of the 24th Division were relieved by fresh troops of the newly arrived 32nd Division, which took up the fight for control of the Ormoc corridor. In an effort to approach the eastern flank of the corridor, the 1st Cavalry Division, with units of the 24th attached, began a concerted drive southwest from the Yarrow-Karigara road in the Mount Badian sector. The mountainous terrain and torrential rains, combined with well-planned and fierce Japanese counterattacks, made progress exceedingly difficult. Even after the 112th Cavalry was added to the division on the 14th of November, the advance through the wild, hilly country against an unyielding enemy remained slow and arduous, continuing into December. In the 24 Corps sector, the 7th Division reached Beibei on the Camotes Sea early in November. Other elements of the 7th Division probed enemy positions in the mountains west of Dagami and Burawen. By the 25th of November, the bulk of the 7th Division had displaced to the west coast of Leyte. The 96th Division, taking up the attack in the central sector, moved westward in a series of strong actions and was then halted by deeply entrenched enemy forces. At this point, the Japanese were trying to hold in order to prepare a counterattack, and all available remnants of the Japanese 16th Division were placed in positions well chosen to guard the southeastern approaches to the Ormoc corridor. One regiment of the US 96th Division moved northwestward from Dagami to outflank enemy positions and secure the mountain passes leading westward in the Alto Peak area. On the 18th of November, the 11th Airborne Division arrived on Leyte and was committed to action in the 1224 Corps area on the left flank of the 96th Division. Its mission was to control the passes into Leyte Valley and to secure the western exit from the mountains into the coastal corridor running along Ormoc Bay, thus protecting the flank of the 7th Division. The paratroopers had to change practically overnight from an airborne to a mountain division as they moved across the rough terrain west of Burawen over a twisting, ill-defined road that wound toward Albuera on Leyte's west coast. It was intended that the 11th Airborne Division ultimately link up with the 7th Division advancing north from Beibei. By the 15th of November, elements of the 7th Division had pushed their way to Damulan, about 3 miles north of Beibei. Here it seemed the Japanese planned to hold the Palanas River line just above Damulan while they attempted to counterattack eastward toward Burawen. The 7th Division therefore consolidated its forces at Damulan and prepared for a major drive northward in an effort to break through the enemy's river defences. The concentration of the 7th Division on the west coast of Leyte compelled the Japanese to divert large forces from Ormoc and move them southward toward Damulayan. This not only helped disrupt the enemy's plan to recoup his losses by a drive eastward across the mountains, but also served to weaken his garrison in the Ormoc area. As the American ground attack pushed steadily forward, Army and Navy planes continued to give invaluable support to the Leyte operation. The Far Eastern Air Force interdicted potential reaction from the southwest by continuous and damaging raids against enemy bases on Borneo and in the Moluccas. Despite kamikaze attacks and the handicap of adverse weather, carrier planes reduced the threat against U.S. shipping in Leyte Gulf by hitting at the source of the enemy's air counterattacks. Japanese airfields on Luzon were attacked repeatedly between the 5th and 19th of November. Whenever weather permitted, planes from the 3rd and 7th Fleets did their utmost to harass enemy reinforcement shipping and hammered constantly at his convoys en route to Ormoc. After a final successful strike against enemy installations on Luzon on the 25th of November, the exhausted Third Fleet Carrier Force left the Philippines area for a merited and much-needed rest. The protracted use of the carrier forces in support of the Leyte operation necessitated extensive logistic replenishment, repair work, the replacement of casualties, and the recuperation of weary flight personnel. Heavy and unremitting pressure on every front kept the enemy off balance and prevented him from mounting any well-coordinated counter-offensive. Unable to mass his forces, he was compelled to commit in piecemeal fashion, the reserves and reinforcements being brought into Leyte at such great sacrifice to his other battlefronts. The Japanese were determined to hold Leyte, however, and continued to invest heavily in its defence. By the end of November, despite large convoy losses and severe combat attrition, there were 10,000 more enemy troops on Leyte than there had been at the end of October. In a desperate effort to gain the initiative, the Japanese attempted several ambitious airborne actions to disrupt U.S. airdrome installations prior to an attempted ground offensive. Their first efforts miscarried completely. On the 26th of November, enemy transport planes landed in the frothing surf on the east coast of Leyte in the sector of the 24th Corps. Although some survivors managed to reach shore armed with demolition materials, they failed to accomplish any effective results. Another enemy transport plane attempted to land at WWII airfield, but was quickly destroyed by anti-aircraft fire. Undeterred by these reverses, the Japanese maintained a vigorous defence of all Ormoc corridor approaches, strengthened their positions, and regrouped their forces. On the 6th of December, they undertook yet another airborne assault. This time, the Tacloban and Dulag airfields were to be neutralised, while the strips at Burauen were to be occupied and seized by airborne landings. At the same time, units of the Japanese 16th and 26th Divisions were to launch a drive to reach Burauen, penetrate the airfield defences, and oust the Americans from control of the airdrome. Preceded by bombing attacks and a smokescreen, about 250 hostile paratroops descended at twilight on the San Pablo and Buri airstrips. To coincide with these landings, enemy ground forces had begun a drive north and south of Burauen. Although the Japanese paratroops were initially successful, the ground forces in the vicinity had been so decimated and disorganized that their offensive efforts in the main were negligible and easily repelled. Scattered remnants of the enemy, however, managed to infiltrate onto the San Pablo and Bayug airstrips, while a small concentration of parachutists held out on Buri. United States forces took quick countermeasures to remove this threat to their positions. A strong assault by troops of the 11th Airborne Division was launched to regain control of the airdrome. By the 11th of December, the last remnants of the enemy had been eliminated, and the Burauen area was declared secure. The Japanese had failed in their main objective, but their short-lived assault did cause considerable damage and upset, to some extent, the supply mechanism of the Sixth Army areas. The slow development of airfields on Leyte, the resultant inadequacy of air support, and the urgent need for the rehabilitation of essential naval units caused a postponement in the next scheduled assault on Mindoro. Originally, the date for the Mindoro operation had been set for the 5th of December, but on the 1st of December, General MacArthur directed that the operation be delayed for 10 days. The deferment of the Mindoro landings had an immediate and important influence on the Leyte campaign. General Kruger had long recognized the decisive advantage, heretofore the lack of fighter cover to ensure the safety of convoys entering the Camotes Sea, and the fact that supporting naval forces did not have sufficient landing craft and resupply shipping to maintain amphibious operations, prevented the mounting of any sizable seaborne assault. The postponement of the Mindoro invasion released shipping previously earmarked for that operation, and made available enough assault craft and naval support to carry out a landing in the Ormoc area. Moreover, the outlook for more effective land-based air support improved when 5 Marine fighter squadrons began operating from Leyte airfields on the 4th of December. General Kruger felt that the time was opportune for a strike on the west coast of Leyte and began immediate preparations to bring the necessary forces into position. On the 23rd of November, the 77th Division, diverted en route from Guam to Guadalcanal, had landed on Leyte in the rear areas of the 13th Corps in order to stage for the forthcoming assault on Mindoro. General Kruger decided to use this division in a major effort to force a rapid conclusion to the Leyte campaign. Accordingly, he issued orders for the 77th Division to land in the Ormoc area in conjunction with a coordinated drive by units of the X and 24 Corps. The United States forces on Leyte commenced attacks in all sectors. On the 5th of December, the 7th Division at Damulan drove northward and succeeded in breaching the enemy defences at the Palanas River. At the same time, the 11th Airborne Division on the east and the X-Corps on the north intensified their attacks on the Ormoc corridor. In an effort to meet the heavy pressure developing simultaneously from three directions, the Japanese hurriedly shifted all available forces to the threatened fronts. The combined land offensive by both X-Corps and 24 Corps units effectively diverted the bulk of the enemy reserves from the Ormoc sector and paved the way for an amphibious assault on Ormoc itself. The time had arrived when the enemy's back door to Leyte could be slammed shut. The assault on Ormoc marked a historic date. On the 7th of December, the third anniversary of Pearl Harbor, the 77th Division sailed around the southern tip of Leyte in a shore-to-shore movement from the east coast and landed near Deposito, about 3 miles south of Ormoc. The Japanese reacted immediately to the threatened sealing off of their main supply route and employed their remaining planes in the Visayas in an intensive effort to cripple the U.S. convoy. In spite of this aerial opposition, which succeeded in inflicting serious damage on the ships and destroyers in the convoy, the division unloaded rapidly and established a firm beachhead. The strategic implications of the Ormoc landing were described by General MacArthur in his communiqué of the day. By this manoeuvre we have seized the centre of the Yamashita line from the rear and have split the enemy's forces in two, isolating those in the valley to the north from those along the coast to the south. Both segments are now caught between our columns, which are pressing in from all fronts. The 77th Division moved northward against gradually stiffening opposition and advanced to the town of Ipil, where heavy enemy defences necessitated a temporary halt. In the meantime, the 7th Division had begun a drive from the Palanas River to pinch off the Japanese force caught along the coast, south of Deposito. This force, squeezed between the 7th Division on the south and the 77th Division on the north, had no choice but to retreat to the east and join other remnants of the battered units entrenched in the mountainous regions of central Leyte. Part of the 7th Division then commenced a drive to link forces with the 11th Airborne Division, which was still moving steadily westward from Burauen against well-fortified enemy positions. The 77th Division resumed its advance from Ipil and, hammering down fierce enemy resistance, entered the town of Ormoc on the 10th of December. The next day, the American divisions along the coast established contact at Ipil. This tactical junction was covered in a communiqué of the 12th of December. The southern segment of the Yamashita line has now been eliminated, and the junction of the 7th and 77th Divisions has been effected. The enemy forces which were trapped between the two have been destroyed. Great quantities of supplies of all kinds were captured. The fighting in Ormoc itself, before its fall, was of the most desperate character, with the entire defending garrison being destroyed. As soon as General Yamashita in Manila was notified of the American landings near Ormoc, he abandoned all plans for continuing the Burauen offensive and diverted additional troops to the west coast. Determined to hold Leyte at all costs, he ordered the Japanese 68th Brigade, whose original mission to support the Burauen attack was thwarted by the Ormoc landing, to land at Palompon on the 7th of December and approach Ormoc from the northwest. By this time, General MacArthur's air arm had strengthened considerably, and the Japanese convoy was so battered en route by 5th Air Force planes that the reinforcing brigade was compelled to make an emergency landing at San Isidro on the northwestern tip of Leyte, where it found itself without artillery and completely cut off from its headquarters. Even in the face of these losses and a rapidly deteriorating battle situation, the enemy continued to send additional troops to Leyte. On the 11th of December, another enemy convoy moving stubbornly into Palompon was attacked by US planes and sustained heavy damage. On the same day, enemy naval troops, ignorant of the American landing, disembarked at Ormoc itself, only a short distance from the occupying 77th Division. These final reinforcements, however, were destined to have little influence on the final outcome of the Leyte operation. After consolidating in new positions above Ormoc, the 77th Division initiated an attack in full strength along and to the west of Highway No. 2. Its objective this time was Valencia, about 10 miles to the north, a key position in the Ormoc corridor. Although the Japanese fought bitterly for their last major stronghold on Leyte, Valencia and its adjoining airfield were in American hands by the 18th of December. The 77th Division requested authority to continue its drive northward and achieve a junction with the X-Corps before the enemy could regroup his scattered forces. Permission was speedily granted, and the division took up its advance along the highway. In the meantime, the X-Corps, operating in the north, had no easy time pushing down the Ormoc corridor to meet the TWI-4 Corps units. The supply of forward troops had become a major problem. The 32nd Division in the Lyman area and artillery along Carigara Bay were supplied by amphibious craft running between Carigara and Pinamapoan. To the southeast, the 1st Cavalry Division was forced to supply itself by hand carry over rain-soaked trails. Casualties, which could not be evacuated by Cub plane because of the lack of suitable landing terrain, were initially evacuated by native bearers and later by tractor. From Lyman, which was captured on the 24th of November, the 32nd Division pressed slowly southward against a fiercely defending foe, measuring many days' progress in mere hundreds of yards. The 1st Cavalry Division forces in the regions between the Ormoc Corridor and Leyte Valley continued to pick their way through the mountains until they were in a position from which they could debouch onto the main highway. On the 19th of December, cavalry units captured Launoy on the highway and cut off the enemy's supply line to his forces opposing the 32nd Division. Turning south, the cavalrymen then moved on to Kananga, where contact was made with elements of the 77th Division. The enemy had fought valiantly to hold his Leyte lifeline by maintaining control of the Ormoc corridor, but he found it impossible to cope with General Kruger's three-way offensive. Japanese forces were now chopped into isolated segments, either struggling in small pockets along Highway No. 2 or retreating into the comparative security of the mountains. Organized enemy resistance in Leyte's most fiercely contested region was finally brought to an end. On the 25th of December, the last connecting road between the enemy's chief remaining port of entry for reinforcements and his troops inland was severed when 77th Division units, in an amphibious maneuver, landed near Palompon and seized the town. San Isidro Bay was likewise neutralized by a landing of a portion of the 24th Division at Kalubian. The 24th Division troops bolstered the efforts of the guerrilla forces in that area and prevented further effective use of San Isidro Harbour by the Japanese. Samar, too, had been effectively denied to the enemy. Units of the 1st Cavalry Division had advanced against stiff resistance to the strategic Taft-Wright Highway, which ran across central Samar. On the 8th of December, the cavalrymen captured Wright, the western terminus of the highway, and then turned eastward to make contact with friendly guerrilla forces advancing from Taft on the opposite coast. The tactical objective on Samar, control of the Taft-Wright Highway, had been achieved. General MacArthur now controlled all major supply and communication routes of the enemy, and on the 25th of December he declared Leyte secure. The Leyte-Samar campaign can now be regarded as closed except for minor mopping up. General Yamashita has sustained perhaps the greatest defeat in the military annals of the Japanese army. The battle for Leyte demonstrated, more than ever before in the Pacific War, the coordinated striking power of the American land, air, and naval team. Despite heroic efforts and great courage, and despite the use of unprecedented numbers of ships, planes, and troops collected from all parts of their fast-shrinking empire, the Japanese were unable to stand before the overwhelming drive of American combined arms. The Japanese suffered irreparable defeat in the Leyte campaign. Every phase of their ambitious show plan for the defense of the Philippines met with complete and irretrievable failure. Driven to near panic by the threat of losing the Philippines, Japan's wartime leaders in Tokyo had risked their remaining offensive power in one last effort to save their empire. Whatever chance the Japanese had to regain the initiative in the Pacific was lost at Leyte. In the largest and most widespread sea battle in history, Japan's naval power had been smashed. The losses sustained by the Japanese fleet are among the most staggering on record. After Leyte, Allied warships could sail with impunity anywhere in the Pacific. Japanese air power as an organized force was also destroyed in the Philippines. The employment of planes in kamikaze tactics not only reflected an extreme shortage of aircraft and trained personnel, but also revealed the desperate plight of the minds that manipulated Japan's war strategy. The kamikaze was the last fierce sputter of a burned-out and dying air force. On the ground, General MacArthur's troops met the enemy for the first time en masse, with armies and corps pitted against each other in comparatively free maneuver. The Japanese, determined to retrieve their positions at any cost, dispatched troops from China and Manchuria and from all corners of the Philippines to the Leyte battlefront. Paralleling their performance in New Guinea and in the Solomons, the Japanese yielded nothing without a bitter fight, and it took daring and skillful maneuver on the part of the American soldier to pry them out of their well-prepared positions or break up their desperate counterattacks. All enemy efforts, however, proved in vain. Their movements were anticipated, their divisions decimated, and their troops were forced to flee, starving and demoralized, into the hills and mountains of Inner Leyte. General MacArthur's victory on Leyte was decisive and final. Once more, General MacArthur had caught the enemy off balance and gained the decisive advantage of tactical surprise. The Japanese had anticipated an invasion of the Philippines, but they did not know when or where the blow would fall. They were especially unprepared on Leyte. The speed with which the great convoy was unloaded and the rapid drive inland surprised and confused the Japanese. In spite of having been consistently outmaneuvered in New Guinea, the Japanese apparently learned little about the strength and versatility of the American ground, air, and naval machine. The Japanese failure on Leyte was also due in great measure to deficiencies in their procurement of intelligence, and by the same token, Allied success owed much to a superior intelligence organization. The enemy's piecemeal efforts to reinforce Leyte compromised his Luzon defense plan and drained the southern Philippines of combat strength. The cost to the Japanese in their reinforcement attempts was enormous. American air power crippled Japanese convoys, and while some troops were able to make shore, the bulk of combat material and supplies was often lost. Strong reinforcements did arrive at Leyte, but so great were the losses involved that General Yamashita's staff eventually accepted the view that an effective defense of the Philippines, or even of Luzon alone, had become impossible. The Japanese resolution to fight the decisive battle in the Visayas had come too late. The battle for Leyte brought other valuable lessons into sharp relief. Although past operations in the Pacific had demonstrated what could be accomplished with controlled air power, Leyte showed how a lack of aerial supremacy at a critical juncture could change the whole complexion of an operation. The definite need for the establishment of forward air bases in the early stages of a campaign was revealed more clearly in Leyte than in any previous operation. In the European theatre, bombers could operate from the same fields over long periods of time due to relatively short flight distances, but Southwest Pacific Air units seldom stayed in one locality more than 2 months before they had to establish new fields 300 to 500 miles away. Consequently, Pacific operations demanded mobile and flexible tactical air combat teams that could transfer their base of operations at a moment's notice to keep pace with the rapid forward strides of General MacArthur's ground forces. The weakness in offensive air power in the Leyte operation The weakness in offensive air power in the early phases of the Leyte operation was directly attributable to adverse weather and difficult terrain. A combination of continuous typhoons, heavy rains, poor drainage, and thick silt formations made it impossible to condition forward airfields as rapidly as the growing scope of the campaign demanded. Consequently, the Japanese could carry out their initial reinforcement program with comparative success. As a result, United States ground forces met increasing numbers of enemy troops, and the successful conclusion of the battle was prolonged beyond schedule. The Leyte operation emphasized the inherent risks of divided command. In the naval action, two key American commanders were independent of each other, one under General MacArthur and the other under Admiral Nimitz. Both operated in the same waters and in the same battle. Divided command affected the Allies primarily in the sea fight for Leyte Gulf, but it also ran like a cancer throughout the operations of the Japanese armed forces in the Philippines. The Japanese defeat on Leyte brought American forces almost to the China Sea, placing them in a position to sever the sea routes connecting Japan with her empire to the south. This menace to the safety of her sea lanes drastically reduced the volume of traffic between Japan and her conquered territories. With access to her resources in the Netherlands, East Indies and Malaya in danger of being completely cut off, Japan's hopes for successfully continuing the conflict were rapidly diminishing. General MacArthur had kept his faith. His return to the Philippines was a dramatic and singular fulfillment of historical destiny. A year before the assault against Leyte, his forces had been deep in the tangled jungles and swamps of New Guinea, almost 1,500 miles from the Philippines. Now he had led them into the very heart of the islands, into a position to become masters of the archipelago. On the third anniversary of the Japanese attack against the Philippines, General MacArthur's forces were organizing the final blows that would lead to the capture of Manila and the surrender of General Yamashita's troops on Luzon. The dark shadow of defeat was edging ever faster across the face of the rising sun of Japan. The hour of total eclipse was not far off. The curtain was raised on another stage of the Philippine theatre, while the concluding act of the Leyte operation was still in progress. This time the scene was set in Mindoro, the last stepping stone to the island of Luzon. The occupation of Mindoro, as an immediate prelude to the main assault on Luzon, was outlined in the final musketeer plan of the Southwest Pacific area. The sudden advancement of the date for the Leyte invasion had necessitated certain revisions in General MacArthur's original scheme of maneuver for the recapture of the Philippine Islands. To include the latest developments in the fast-changing picture, a third musketeer plan was prepared on the 26th of September, covering operations to take place as soon as the seizure of Leyte was successfully accomplished. Under Musketeer III, the first operation scheduled to follow the initial entry into the Philippines was the seizure of southwest Mindoro, contemplated for the 5th of December 1944. The full-scale invasion of Luzon, with landings along Lingayen Gulf, was projected for the 20th of December, when it was expected that the airfields on Mindoro would be ready for use. Contingent provision was also made to support the Lingayen landing, if necessary, by an assault at Dingalan Bay on the east-central coast of Luzon. To provide for a fluctuating tactical situation, a preliminary attack at Apari in northern Luzon was also tentatively outlined. This last operation, however, would take place only if carrier-borne aircraft could not ensure uninterrupted transit of naval assault shipping around northern Luzon, should such an alternate route be chosen. Concurrently with these operations, all other available Southwest Pacific forces were to undertake the consolidation of the Visayas, Mindanao, Palawan, and the Sulu archipelago. It was planned that the Eighth Army would conduct these mop-up campaigns with such assistance as could be obtained from guerrilla units organized throughout the central and southern Philippines. Approval of Musketeer III by the Joint Chiefs of Staff was dependent upon a final decision on the next major operation to be undertaken after Leyte. General MacArthur's plans called for an immediate invasion of Luzon as soon as success on Leyte was assured. Other ideas were being studied for bypassing Luzon and shifting the main effort of the Allies farther north. For some time, a direct attack on Formosa had been advocated to eliminate that island as an enemy assembly area and advance air transfer point. Allied occupation of Formosa would enable the utilization of its airfields for heavy bombers to operate in conjunction with the newly acquired bases in the Marianas. At the same time, the island would provide a staging area close to the heart of Japan. In addition, it was pointed out that Formosa could be used by the Allies to assist operations in China and prevent the consolidation of the Chinese coastal regions by the Japanese. General MacArthur did not believe that any operation should be undertaken against Formosa until the northern Philippines were firmly in Allied hands. Without Luzon, an invasion of Formosa would be logistically precarious in view of its great distance from the nearest available Allied bases, necessitating the movement of forces over extremely long and attenuated lines of supply. On the other hand, he felt that the Central Plain Manila area on Luzon could be cleared of organized enemy units by February 1945 if the Lingayen landings were made on schedule, permitting operations north of the Philippines to be carried out earlier and with less risk than would otherwise be feasible, since it was generally agreed that an assault against Formosa could not be prepared before February. Then, too, General MacArthur estimated that, with the obvious tactical and strategic advantages inherent in the establishment of extensive air and supply bases on Luzon, an invasion of Formosa would become unnecessary. Another major consideration in the choice of targets was the general shortage of service troops in the Pacific Theatre. An invasion of Formosa would undoubtedly necessitate a large-scale transfer of service personnel from the Southwest Pacific area. Already critically short for operations in progress, General MacArthur was unable to commit any service units from his command to an assault on Formosa. In this respect, he pointed out that the native population was an important factor in planning future operations. In Luzon, the Allies could depend upon thousands of loyal Filipinos to augment service troops by working as stevedores, engineers, carpenters, drivers, and in other fields of skilled and semi-skilled labor. The guerrillas, too, would undoubtedly play a large part in assisting a Luzon assault. In any event, General MacArthur contended that an invasion of Luzon as the next step in the Allied advance would be the most logical development in the strategy of Pacific operations, since Formosa would not be a secure and satisfactory base so long as Luzon remained in enemy hands. On the 3rd of October 1944, after careful examination of all the complex factors involved, the Joint Chiefs of Staff made their decision. In accordance with the general outline of SWPA's Musketeer III plan, General MacArthur was instructed to occupy Luzon with a target date of the 20th of December 1944. He was also to establish bases on northern Luzon to support further Allied advances, including an assault by the Central Pacific Forces against the Nansei Shoto, Ryukyu Islands, an operation set tentatively for the 1st of March 1945. Directives for possible operations against Formosa were withheld, pending further developments in the Philippine campaign. As the Leyte operation progressed and the enemy's kamikaze attacks became more damaging, some questions again arose as to the advisability of a direct approach from Leyte to Luzon. Naval commanders feared that an Allied convoy passing through the narrow, restricted waters of the central Visayas would be subject to heavy air attack from the many enemy airfields in the surrounding islands. It was proposed that the alternate plan for the prior seizure of positions on Apari be carried out to ensure fighter cover for resupply ships, which could then be routed around northern Luzon, where more open seas permitted greater protection and safer passage. General MacArthur and his staff, however, favoured moving the 7th Fleet and the necessary amphibious forces to Luzon along the southern route from Leyte via Mindoro. Although the danger of enemy air attacks would have to be faced during the initial invasion of Mindoro and the subsequent supply of forces located there, it was felt that once the new airfields were established, the Allies would have a much shorter route to Lingayen Gulf with greater air protection and less exposure to the vicissitudes of typhoon weather than the suggested route around northern Luzon. In addition to these considerations, there was the added factor that an invasion of Apari would delay the all-important Lingayen operation by at least a month. After a series of conferences between members of General MacArthur's and Admiral Nimitz's staffs early in November, it was generally agreed that the major amphibious forces would approach Lingayen Gulf through the Visayan waters, while the powerful ships and carrier planes of the 3rd Fleet operated north of Luzon in cover and support missions. It was also decided that the Apari operation need not be undertaken. Even before the Sixth Army had left Hollandia for the Leyte assault, General MacArthur had issued instructions to General Kruger to prepare tentative field orders for the Mindoro invasion. Many of the details for the projected landings were worked out aboard ship while the convoy was en route to the Leyte beaches. To conduct the ground operations on Mindoro, General Kruger constituted the Western Visayan Task Force under the command of Brig. General William C. Dunkel. The initial plan contemplated a landing on the 5th of December in a combined airborne and amphibious manoeuvre, which would secure the San Jose area near the southwest coast in order to make immediate use of its airstrips for the support of the Luzon operations and to counter the many Japanese airfields located on Luzon. The delay in the development of Leyte airdromes and the continuing need for air support of the Leyte ground forces caused several changes in this original Mindoro plan. Fighters and bombers occupied all available space on the Leyte airstrips, and there was no room for the large transports that would have to carry the paratroops to Mindoro. Consequently, the airborne phase was cancelled, and instead arrangements were made to transport the parachute regiment by water in LCIs. The status of airfield construction on Leyte also made it questionable whether land-based planes would be in position by the 5th of December to cover the dangerous interim period between the landings and the activation of new strips on Mindoro. The peculiarity of weather conditions in the Philippines further complicated the problem. 5th Air Force planes based on Leyte were handicapped by the seasonal bad weather common to the eastern Visayas, while flying conditions prevailing over enemy airfields in the Sulu Sea area were usually excellent. Hostile aircraft flying in from the west would thus be permitted to attack Allied convoys at Mindoro with little fear of counteraction by grounded Allied planes. After thoroughly considering the airfield construction problem, various naval recommendations, and the relatively low level of supplies on Leyte, General MacArthur decided to postpone the Mindoro operation for 10 days to the 15th of December. The interlude was used to good advantage. While the Leyte airstrips were being developed and repaired, the Allied landings at Ormoc sped the Leyte operation to a successful culmination. In addition, the orders for the Mindoro assault were amended to include the seizure of the Calapan area on the northern coast and the occupation of Marinduque Island to the northeast, to help foster an illusion that the next major Allied strike would be against the Batangas-Bicol region of Luzon. On the 12th of December 1944, the Western Visayan Task Force, escorted by warships of the 7th Fleet, sailed from the Dulag area of Leyte and set a course for Mindoro via Surigao Strait. The voyage through the restricted waters of the Philippines was not without incident. The Japanese were quick to spot the convoy, and, although most of their efforts were relatively minor, one strike was particularly damaging. In the early afternoon of the 13th of December, a single-engine kamikaze plane, swooping in from the direction of Siquijor Island, skimmed swiftly across the glassy waters of the Mindanao Sea and crashed headlong into the superstructure of the Nashville, the flagship of the task force. Losses in the resultant explosions were heavy, with estimated casualties of 31 killed and 158 wounded. General Dunkel and several of his staff were hit by flying fragments, and the Nashville itself was put out of action and forced to return to Leyte. As the amphibious forces sailed through the Sulu Sea, powerful groups of the Third Fleet threw a neutralizing blanket of carrier planes over Luzon from the east. Continuous air patrols over enemy airfields prevented any sizable sorties by Japanese aircraft. Control of the air corridors over Luzon was held until the evening of the 16th, when a raging typhoon struck with devastating effect and forced the Third Fleet to postpone its air operation. Although the direction and timing of General MacArthur's next move after Leyte was, in general, correctly estimated by the Japanese, an actual landing in force on Mindoro was not considered probable. In early November, the staff of the Japanese 14th Area Army judged that the U.S. 6th Army would achieve tactical control over Leyte by the first part of December. General MacArthur's next assault, it was assumed, would be made somewhere in the western Visayas, probably on Panay or Negros. This conclusion was based upon the supposition that any amphibious force of the size needed to invade an island as large as Luzon would require air bases farther advanced and better situated with regard to weather than Leyte was able to provide. Air sites in the western Visayas, especially on Panay, were already developed and far superior to those on Mindoro. From the point of view of the Japanese, who were without bulldozers and pierced steel mat runways, the terrain of Mindoro was generally unfavourable for airbase construction, and except for the small airfield at San Jose, there seemed little to tempt an American invasion. It was presumed, therefore, that one of the islands in the western Visayas would be General MacArthur's next target, and that Mindoro would be bypassed on his route of advance to Luzon. So unexpected was an American assault on Mindoro prior to a main invasion of Luzon, that even when the task force was sighted in the Mindanao Sea on the 13th of December, the Japanese estimated its destination as Negros or Panay. During the 14th, enemy patrol planes searched the beach waters of these two islands, fully expecting to find American landing operations already underway. Even when the convoy had progressed beyond the western Visayas, there were still some elements in the Japanese High Command, especially in the naval and air forces, who held that a landing directly on Luzon was in the offing. Only when the American convoy was finally anchored off San Jose did the Japanese discover that Mindoro was the ultimate objective of the amphibious assault forces. On the 15th of December, after sailing past Negros and Panay with further interference from the enemy limited to weak raiding missions, the assault ships of the Western Visayan Task Force drew close to the beaches of southwest Mindoro. Following a short naval bombardment, troops of the 19th RCT and the 503rd Parachute Regiment went ashore without opposition and pushed rapidly inland. The landing phase of the invasion was accomplished without the loss of a single Allied soldier, although several kamikaze planes managed to penetrate the transport's air cover, sinking 2 LSTs and damaging a destroyer. In order that the convoy be exposed to enemy air attack for as short a time as possible, some 200 combat troops of the 77th Division had accompanied the assault forces to be utilized at the beachhead for the sole purpose of unloading the necessary equipment. The innovation, improvised to overcome the shortage of service troops, was highly successful, and all materiel was transferred to the beaches before nightfall. Their work completed, the 77th Division troops were then returned to Leyte with the emptied ships. By noon of the invasion day, the town of San Jose had been occupied, and work was begun on its airstrips. Australian construction troops assisted in the conditioning of the airfields, 2 of which were already in use by the 23rd of December. Mindoro was but lightly defended by the Japanese, and 6th Army operations in the objective area consisted mainly of patrolling and light skirmishing. The main efforts of the Japanese to interfere with the Mindoro operation were confined primarily to actions by their air and naval forces. Allied resupply convoys ran a gauntlet of determined and damaging kamikaze attacks as they traversed the dangerous waters en route to the Mindoro beachhead. For a time, the destruction wrought by these kamikaze assaults created a serious problem, especially with regard to aviation gasoline and Air Force technical supplies. Troops ashore were also subjected to sporadic and fatiguing night raids by hostile aircraft. During the evening of the 26th of December, a Japanese naval task force consisting of 2 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and 3 destroyer escorts attempted an ambitious bombardment of Allied shore installations, but the enemy plan fell far short of its purpose. In its approach to the beachhead, the Japanese task force lost the destroyer Kiyoshimo to Allied air attack, and the damage suffered by the other ships limited the accuracy and power of its gunnery. The total effect of the bombardment was negligible, and the damage was easily repaired. Several attempted torpedo strikes against ships at anchor were similarly abortive. This was the last time that major surface units of the Japanese fleet interfered with Allied shore operations in the Philippines. The primary purpose of the seizure of Mindoro was to establish airfields from which land-based aircraft could bomb selected targets on Luzon and at the same time protect the assault and resupply shipping en route to Lingayen Gulf. Supplementing this aim was an extensive deception plan to obfuscate Japan's military leaders as they tried to anticipate General MacArthur's next target after Mindoro. This plan was twofold in intent. From a broad strategic viewpoint, it attempted by means of extensive naval operations in nearby waters to direct the enemy's attention to a possible Allied threat against Formosa and southern Japan. Tactically, it aimed to undertake such measures as would lead the enemy to believe that the main thrust of any Allied offensive on Luzon would be launched against western Batangas or the Bicol provinces. Ground operations in furtherance of this plan were directed by the 8th Army, which took over control of Mindoro from the 6th Army on New Year's Day, 1945. As the first step in the tactical deception effort, one company of the 21st Infantry of the 24th Division moved on Bongabong along Mindoro's east coast on the 1st of January. Other troops of the same regiment then advanced by shore-to-shore movement to Calapan, the main town on northeastern Mindoro, while enemy-held villages on the northwestern side were also cleared. In all of these actions, substantial assistance was rendered by organised guerrilla forces. Situated close to southern Luzon's Bicol Peninsula, the next operation undertaken was the occupation of Marinduque Island. On the 3rd of January, a small force of the 21st Infantry landed unopposed at Buena Vista, on the island's southwestern shore, and consolidated positions for the establishment of radar installations. Concurrently with these ground operations, additional steps were taken to conceal the Lingayen invasion plan from the Japanese. While United States bombers struck carefully selected targets on Luzon, other aircraft flew photographic and reconnaissance missions over the Batangas-Tayabas region, and transport planes made dummy drops over the same area to simulate an airborne invasion. At the same time, 7th Fleet motor torpedo boats patrolled the southern and southwestern coasts of Luzon as far north as Manila Bay from new bases on Mindoro, and minesweepers cleared Balayan, Batangas, and Tayabas bays. Landing ships and merchantmen also approached the beaches in these areas until they were fired upon by the enemy and then slipped away under cover of darkness. On instructions from GHQ, the guerrillas in Lower Luzon intensified their activities and conducted ostentatious operations designed to divert Japanese attention to the south. Although it is not clear exactly to what extent these deception measures influenced the operational plans of the Japanese 14th Area Army, it is certain that, in the period during and immediately after the Mindoro assault, the Japanese centered their attention on. To guard against the double threat of the Mindoro convoy either continuing on to Batangas or being the forerunner of a second strike destined for Luzon, additional forces were sent southward. On the 14th of December, the Japanese 71st Infantry was dispatched to Batangas and the 39th Infantry reinforced to Bataan. There is little doubt that, until General Yamashita began the actual deployment of his troops in accordance with his Luzon defence plan of the 19th of December, he remained greatly concerned over the possibility of an imminent invasion of the southern area of the island. In addition to providing an advanced base for airfields and for deceptive operations, the invasion of Mindoro broke the enemy's final link with the Visayas. His communication lines with the southern and central Philippines were completely disrupted, and any further efforts to move his troops from Luzon to the Leyte area were now utterly out of the question. The enemy was also compelled to make major changes in his transport routes between Japan and the southern areas. With the loss of Mindoro, Japan halted shipments of additional reinforcements to the Philippine Islands. Manila Bay was abandoned as a main stopping point for convoys moving to and from the Netherlands' East Indies region, and all remaining shipping lanes were pushed toward the China coast. General MacArthur's campaigns in the southwest Pacific area now neared their climax. The battle for Luzon was at hand. In many respects, the scheme of manoeuvre and organization of forces for the invasion of Luzon paralleled the plan of the Leyte operation. Naval forces were divided into three main sections, with Admiral Kincaid in overall command. The Bombardment and Fire Support Group and the Escort Carrier Group were under Admiral Oldendorf and Admiral Berkey, respectively, the San Fabian Attack Force under Admiral Barbe, and the Lingayen Attack Force under Admiral Wilkinson. The Third Fleet would again provide strategic support for the operation by neutralizing enemy airfields, and at the same time It would be prepared to give direct support whenever necessary. The 5th and 13th Air Force's land-based planes were to protect the flanks and rear by overwater searches and by strikes against enemy installations in the southern Philippines and the Netherlands East Indies. In addition, Army aircraft were to give protection to convoys moving through central Philippine waters and, as far as possible, lend air support to ground operations. As at Leyte, the 6th Army under General Kruger was to land 2 corps abreast. The Corps and 16th Corps, containing the 6th, 37th, 40th and 43rd Divisions in the assault phase, and the 25th Division, 58th Regimental Combat Team, 3rd Armoured Group and 6th Ranger Battalion in reserve, plate number 72. The postponement of the Mindoro operation to the 5th of December caused a corresponding delay in the Lingayen Gulf landing, originally set for the 20th of December. A new target date, the 9th of January 1945, was chosen to give time for the reorganization of forces and for the establishment of airfields on Mindoro, and also to take advantage of the favorable moon and tide conditions. The few extra days were used to replenish and repair fleet units, conduct landing rehearsals, and further coordinate plans for air and naval support. The 3rd Fleet struck its first blows in support of the Lingayen operation on the 3rd of January 1945 in the Formosa and Nansei-Shoto regions. Bad weather hampered most of the carrier strikes, but moderate successes were achieved against the enemy's airfields and harbour shipping. On the 6th of January, the 3rd Fleet moved back into position to begin its neutralization strikes against Japanese installations on Luzon, preparatory to the imminent 6th Army landings. It was fairly certain that the Japanese would throw their remaining air power in the Philippines against General MacArthur's Luzon invasion forces, and it was also anticipated that the major portion of their air effort would consist of the kamikaze technique so effectively introduced at Leyte. Both these expectations were soon realized.